This is your tech news briefing for Thursday, August 25th. I'm Zoe Thomas for the Wall Street Journal. In Beijing's regulatory crackdown on tech, one of the hardest hit sectors has been video games. What's more, China's economy has been weakening under COVID-19 restrictions, meaning fewer people are spending money on games and in-game purchases. So how are Chinese video game makers adapting? Joining us to talk about it is our China tech reporter, Shen Lu. Hey, Shen Lu, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Zoe. Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the situation in China now. What are video game makers facing?
The video game developers, large and small, have borne the brunt of a regulatory crackdown for the past year. Since last year, our authorities in China have approved significantly fewer games than before and tightened censorship of video games and restricted playtime significantly for young gamers. And for some 8 months, China's regulators didn't grant any licenses to new games. And that freeze was lifted in April, but game makers are getting far fewer titles approved this year.
China has had some pretty tough censorship rules for a while. How is this situation different in terms of getting games approved?
So you're right. China has been curbing the video game sector since 2018. In 2018, authorities froze title approval for some 9 months. And then they froze the title approvals again in 2021. The restrictions were lifted in April, but video game makers we talked to for the story told us that now the timeline for getting title approval is much longer, which means after investing a lot of money in making video games and operating them and buying server storage, they can't charge users until they get their title approval. So when the application is stuck in the queue, they can't make money off of their games.
What are authorities looking for? Are there specific things that the censors are objecting to?
That's a billion-dollar question. Everybody wants to know. The video game developers certainly want to know why the authorities are delaying approving and what they are actually looking for in the video game content. People we've talked to told us that the process has largely been non-transparent. But late last year, executives at video game developers participated in a workshop where authorities told them certain contents were not allowed in video game content, and those include same-sex relationships, transgender identities, or what authorities deemed fabricated historical events.
I know another challenge that they're facing that we've talked about on this show before is the limit of playtime that China has placed on young gamers, those under 18. So given all of these challenges, Chinese video game makers are starting to look overseas. How are they doing that?
So far, video game developers, big and small, are looking for opportunities overseas. For example, Tencent, the world's largest video game maker, has doubled down on buying and joining with foreign studios. This year, NetEase, China's second largest video game developer, has opened 2 new studios abroad at least this year, and less known Chinese video game publishers like MiHoYo and Lilith Games have also established their global publishing labels to cater to an international audience overseas. So it's a mix of acquiring studios and partnering with studios or buying IPs and establishing their own global headquarters and publishing labels.
How big of a shift is this? I mean, is this Chinese video game company saying, we're just too big for our current market, or is this a full recalibration of their current business structure and their business strategy?
Large companies are more concerned about future growth opportunities, so they're actively exploring new growth opportunities overseas as we see the number of game players and the revenue from the Chinese games market both declined in the first half of 2022, but the revenue from overseas has grown. So this is one of the main reasons why Chinese companies are actively accelerating their expansion overseas. But for smaller companies, the tighter regulation, which means Chinese regulators are approving fewer new titles each year now is detrimental to the smaller companies' businesses because they're waiting for the approval of new games to be able to monetize the games. So for a lot of video game developers, there's a new urgency around expanding their businesses overseas because many think that if they don't expand to overseas markets, they're going to die in the domestic market.
How are Chinese regulators reacting to this shift overseas? Are they concerned at all about Chinese game makers starting to sell more overseas?
So far, we haven't seen any sign of Chinese regulators being concerned about video game developers expanding overseas. In fact, they are encouraging video game developers and other content makers to sort of export their content and the Chinese culture overseas because China also wants to exert its soft power overseas, and a video game is a great venue for that.
So I wonder what this means then for video game players and for the company's kind of long-term outlooks. Is this going to change kind of how they see themselves going forward?
Yeah, so several large video game makers have said they're going to focus on global players instead of focusing on just one geographic region. And NetEase particularly, its CEO has said that they want their international game revenue to account for about half of its total game revenue, which is a significant jump from the current 10%. So that tells us about how overseas market is important for Chinese video game makers now.
All right, that's our China tech reporter, Shen Lu. Shen Lu, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Zoe.
And that's today's Tech News Briefing. If you're looking for more tech stories, head over to WSJ.com. And if you enjoyed this show, how about leaving us a 5-star rating and a review wherever you get your podcasts? I'm Zoe Thomas for The Wall Street Journal. Thanks for listening.